for our third cohort of fellows in about 2 or 3 weeks. In December, we will be sharing that on our project mailing list, and we're looking forward to lots of applications for our third cohort of fellows. What we're doing tonight is having a conversation that will anticipate the conversations we'll have with our second cohort of fellows in January with some of the fellows from our first cohort of fellows. These are friends of mine. I was part of the first cohort as well. We've known each other very well. And many of them will actually be moderating the discussions with the second cohort of fellows in January. So we thought before we start sharing the findings and papers from the second cohort of fellows, we could have a discussion with some of the fellows from the first cohort about the present state of U.S.-China relations at this really important inflection point between administrations from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. So that is the purpose of today's program, to kind of get a gut check on where we are, and then to anticipate some of the new work that our new cohort of fellows will be sharing with you in January. Let me invite the other panelists to join me on screen so I can briefly introduce them to all of you, and then we will get going. We're planning to go for about an hour and 15 minutes, and we're reserving a lot of time for questions from all of you in the audience. The way to ask those questions will be through the Q&A function. So when we get to that point of the program, I very much hope that people will ask questions that I can then pose to the panelists. Let me introduce to you in the order that I see on screen here. Mark Wu, professor of law at Harvard University, where he's also the director of the Fairbanks Center for China Studies. Dave Rank, who, as youthful as he is, was not one of our first group of fellows, but is one of the senior advisors to the project. We're so grateful that he does that, and he's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Angel Xu, a professor at University of North Carolina Public Policy, who is joining us very early in the morning from Singapore. Thanks so much for joining, Angel. Mary Gallagher, who in the first iteration of the project was at the time professor of Chinese politics at the University of Michigan, but she is now Dean Gallagher of the Keough School for Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I will try to refer to you as Dean Gallagher throughout the conversation. And Maggie Lewis, professor of law and also associate dean at Seton Hall University. So great to see all of you. I'm so excited for this conversation. Let's start by kind of thinking about what is the legacy of the Biden administration on U.S.-China relations. What is the current state of play after the last 4 years across all of the different issues that you all look at? And then we'll move on from there. But just to get us kind of situated, let's start with that. And maybe I'll go to Dave Rank first. And I'll ask Dave to maybe speak to security issues, which include, but maybe are not limited to, tensions in the South China Sea, tensions across the Taiwan Strait, and maybe other tensions as the U.S. and Chinese militaries increasingly come into some kind of fraught proximity. What is your sense, Dave, of where we are right now after the last 4 years of the Biden administration on those kinds of issues?
Thanks, Neysun, and it's great to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. So I'm not speaking for the Biden administration. In fact, I'm only speaking for Dave Rank. But if I were, I would give us a grade of an A+, right? That we came in just broadly what the Biden administration's goal was to look at American strengths, rebuild those, things like the American economy. And Mark, I know you're going to talk about trade. I don't want to get too far into that, but would say, look, as far as that part of the competition and that part of the national security sort of imperative of having a viable industrial sector, we have made huge investments in the American economy, and that's a major factor. The other major U.S. strength has been American alliances, traditional ones like the U.S.-Japan alliance in the Asia-Pacific, the Australian alliance, both of those much, much stronger in the Biden administration when than where we were at the end of the Trump administration. On top of that, you talked about the South China Sea and Taiwan. You have the Philippines, where we now have a basing arrangement that allows the United States essentially to station troops very close to where they might be needed if there were conflict in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. Uh, but part of my response to your question is sort of Harold Macmillan's response. He was asked, "What's the greatest challenge of being a statesman?" And his fantastic response was, "Events, my boy, events." The Biden administration came in thinking, look, we're going to have a China policy, but we're going to nest it in a policy that really looks to sort of the sort of holy grail of American diplomacy, of the pivoting to Asia and moving our focus. But Biden's had to deal with the invasion of Ukraine, had to deal with what's going on in Gaza and Israel. And that has been a real challenge to the effort of focusing on the Asia Pacific like they had intended to. But I think they come out at the end of the Biden administration. I'm not sure I'd give an A plus, but they did a pretty good job of delivering on what they intended to do. And they would look back and say, we are in a much better position, or the next president, we'll get to that, I'm sure, were he to pursue a similar set of objectives, would be in a good position to continue to advance American sort of hard security objectives in the Asia Pacific.
Dave, let me ask you a quick follow-up. What's your sense of the communication on some of these hot button issues, and in particular South China Sea and Taiwan? Do you think the two militaries are sufficiently clear to each other about kind of what the state of play for both sides is, in a way that could avoid mistakes or spirals that were maybe not intended, but could happen just as a course of events?
Sure. And I should have mentioned that, because my sort of third element of the Biden administration China policy was to recognize that we're going to have a competitive relationship with China, but to put in place structures that would prevent competition from devolving into conflict. I mean, those structures are now back. They were largely canceled. Was it after the Pelosi visit to Taiwan that led China to cancel most dialogues that hadn't already been canceled or were moribund really since the end of the Obama administration. So those are back on. Before coming to, I spent about 30 years as an American diplomat, and the efficacy of those communication channels, even when they're working, even when they're up and running, is not what it might be. That, if you talk to people in the military to military channels, they work okay until there's a crisis, and then the other sides of, the Chinese side really don't like to pick up the phone unless they know what's going to happen on the other, what the conversation is going to be. So it's good to have those channels, but just having military channels is not a guarantee that, what I see as the real risk, which is an accident in the South China Sea devolving quickly into a crisis. That's the kinds of communications we have with China are not strong enough to manage that kind of crisis. We're going to have to figure out new ones, and we'll probably have to figure out new ones on the fly if or when it happens.
And maybe I'll just squeeze in one more question on this theme to you, Dave, is the question of deterrence. To what extent do you think the Biden administration has communicated what it needs to communicate to deter Chinese aggression, both in the South China Sea, but especially vis-a-vis Taiwan?
It's a tough one, right? Deterrence is a moving target, but ultimately, I think what both in the South China Sea and in Taiwan, part of the Biden administration's goal, even though they don't say it so much, is not so much deterrence, but reassurance to keep Taiwan, to keep the South China Sea off of Xi Jinping's to-do list for the day. That, kicking sometimes, deferring a problem is as good as solving a problem, or it's the best you can do. And so I think that's part of it, in addition to sort of the military investments that the United States is making to at least try to avoid doing things that we know will raise the temperature. You know, on the deterrence side of thing too, the Chinese are doing deterrence as well. They looked at what happened in Ukraine. You talked about other issues. You know, the success of the Russian threat to use nuclear weapons were NATO to get involved directly. I'm sure the Chinese are looking at that, studying that. They are careful students of history and current events, and they will incorporate that into future plans, both in the South China Sea and in Taiwan.
Great. I'm going to go to Maggie later to talk about another set of issues, but Maggie also is very much paying attention to the cross-strait dynamics. I just want to see if, Maggie, if you want to add a word here on just the current state of play after the last 4 years of the Biden administration in terms of deterrence, reassurance, where are we right now before the change of administration?
Well, I was just in Taiwan for a chunk of October, and I'll say my concern is much more about domestic Taiwan politics right now, that there's a real dysfunction going on between the legislative branch and the executive branch, an eating away of the power of the judicial branch. And so the more that Taiwan is wrapped up in its own problems, and there's a lot of them, demographics and energy. Xi Jinping can sit back and eat some popcorn and say, not today, because things might be easier tomorrow. Also, huge questions about how to build resilience domestically, not just changing the military and what people do when they're part of the draft, but more broadly in society, everything from making sure there's better food stocks to, what is the will to fight. So I think it's very complicated. There's a lot of work to be done. There's new director in an AIT, our non-embassy there, who used to be the deputy director. That's a good move. But there is a lot of work to be done. That's for another webinar, though.
Well, we will come to the next steps on these issues in a round or two in this very webinar, so you'll get a chance to sort of prognosticate in the future. But let's move to a different topic area. We started off hot with some of the thorniest security issues. Let's kind of turn the dial to an area that many have thought is a potential area of more cooperative dynamics dealing with climate and environment. And so, Angel, you are our expert in this webinar on climate and environment. What's your sense of where that kind of discussion is now after 4 years of the Biden administration and the relationship between John Kerry and Xie Jianhua and all of that? What's the legacy that the Biden administration is passing on to the next administration?
Well, thanks so much, Neysun, for including me in this conversation and at a humane hour for Singapore. So I'm still a little bit jet lagged, so it actually worked out in my favor. So I would say that the number one legacy that the Biden administration is leaving is nothing short of historic. But it's just really the tip of the iceberg. So it's kind of like seeing the first half of Wicked and then not getting to see the second half, because of course they were able to pass the historic Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure bills, which really, despite their names, are climate and clean energy pieces of legislation. And so these are unbelievably unprecedented historic investments in clean energy and technologies like electric vehicles, carbon capture and storage, clean hydrogen, and they've really spurred nationwide investments in these sectors. They've created jobs and also provided everyday Americans like you and me incentives for energy efficient technologies, and has gotten us excited about things like heat pumps. So I think that's been really quite historic and has really reestablished U.S. legitimacy in the climate and energy space, because we're not just going abroad and telling China what they should be doing on climate change and the environment, but really putting the money where our mouths are and doing things domestically. And I think really putting in a infrastructure in place in terms of these tax credits and these incentives that hopefully will be more enduring. And then along those lines, I think what the Biden administration has been doing in the last couple of years, and particularly before this key May 2024 deadline, is working with the agencies. So I know Maggie and Mark are the lawyers in the room, so they can speak to the importance of having these regulations and the laws in place for the agencies to be able to regulate things like emissions from power plants and to keep on upping the efficiency of appliances through standards, and then also regulating emissions from vehicles. So all of these have been incredibly critical and hopefully will endure despite whatever political shifts might happen. And then, of course, on the international level, I think importantly, what the Biden administration has done is to reestablish some modicum of US leadership on the climate issue abroad. So I was there in 2016 at the climate negotiations right after the US election during Trump's first presidency. And it was just unbelievable to see the wind and the tides just shift from the US pavilion to China, and everybody really looking towards China for leadership on climate change, which we saw to some extent during that period. But I think really having Biden re-engage, I mean, you definitely heard both the UN and other countries echo how important it was to have the US re-engage, particularly on efforts like establishing this global methane pledge. So methane, for the non-climate scientists in the room, has a much higher global warming potential, around 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so to be able to tackle those emissions on a short-term basis yields a much bigger bang for the buck in terms of, I guess, in opposition to carbon dioxide, which is much more long-lived and a lot trickier to regulate. And so US has really, I think, exerted and reasserted a lot of leadership in the climate change space by establishing initiatives like this global methane pledge. And then I think in terms of the China relation, you mentioned this relationship between John Kerry, who was the special envoy for climate change, and Shi Zhenhua, who was the vice minister and a vice minister of NDRC and leading the Chinese delegation on issues of climate change. And that was really important for reestablishing the bilateral relationship on climate change between US and China. And so that was, I think, really very welcomed. The first re-engagement in 2021 after COVID saw a historic announcement between US and China agreeing to reignite and re-engage a lot of these previous areas of cooperation. And I think importantly, these included conversations that had begun in previous years on carbon capture and sequestration, renewable energy deployment. So these are both areas of mutual interest for the US and China. I think also what has been encouraging is the engagement of subnational entities also on the climate issue. And that proved to be really critical during the Trump administration when there was no national bilateral exchange on climate and environmental issues. And if anything, that piece has really accelerated since the first announcements were made all the way back in 2014 about the importance of subnational exchange. So far this year, I've been to 2 subnational exchanges between US and China counterparts to talk about how they can continue advancing collaboration on climate change. And so I think the good news is that I think those pieces will continue to endure. There's so much interest and mutual overlap. I was just in Memphis a couple of weeks ago with a delegation from Hubei and also a delegation from the US Heartlands. And so they were talking about Yangtze, Changjiang, and then Mississippi River exchange in areas of mutual interest and risk with respect to climate change. And we were talking about climate resilience and things that the Chinese were doing that the US could adopt and vice versa. And so I was really encouraged by those particular exchanges. And so I think that's been incredibly positive during the Biden administration.
Angel, let me ask a quick follow-up. So what I thought was really interesting about your answer was that a lot of it was more about just U.S. leadership on climate issues generally and U.S. investments domestically. You did speak a little bit of the especially federal level, dynamic, the, U.S. government and the Chinese government, but that wasn't, I'd say that was like a fourth of your answer. Is that indicative that, to the extent that the Biden administration was making contributions on climate issues, it wasn't as much in terms of the dynamic with China, but across other things? And if there was a dynamic with China, maybe it was as much at the subnational level than it was at the USG level.
Yeah, I would say that that's right. I think that characterization is accurate. I mean, Dave alluded to just complications in the overall larger bilateral relationship between US and China. Pelosi's visit, they also took climate change off the table. So that was one of the areas, one of these bright spots that you had mentioned initially, but that was also off the table. So there was a year where there was no bilateral national exchange between the two sides on climate. And so that's why I think having countries, particularly when the United States is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, continue to do the hard work domestically and to demonstrate internationally that they're serious about tackling climate change. I think that that is more of its weight in gold than to constantly tell China, okay, you should be doing this, and trying to pressure them to take action that they already feel like they're already putting in place on the climate issue.
And this will a little bit anticipate my next set of questions to Mark on trade issues, but I'll ask you this as well, Angel. So, one dimension of the US-China dynamic here has to do with Chinese clean energy sort of technology, right? So my sense is that that contribution to the overall climate goals is not one that we have been welcoming entirely, because there's a competitive element to it that has to do with technological competition and maybe even concerns about trade issues and flooding the market with like Chinese EVs and things like that. So how much does that kind of further complicate the US-China dynamic here on environment issues, even under the Biden administration?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly complicates the situation. And this is something that we tackled in our paper, my paper with Debbie Seligson for this particular project. So the idea that when cooperation becomes trickier due to larger geopolitical tensions and trade tensions, then perhaps a competitive angle might actually be more productive in accelerating this green race to the top. And certainly that's the way that the US has approached the issue, by adopting elements, ironically, of China's green industrial policy in the United States, by focusing on green jobs manufacturing, trying to rehome and reshore a lot of these green jobs back in the US context. I mean, I think overall it's much slower. This is what Joanna Lewis, part of the second generation of fellows, has been focusing on for her topic. And so clearly she looks at a lot of these types of dynamics on green technology development. And it's definitely a lot slower. It's a lot less efficient, because China already is home to all of these supply chains and manufacturing centers. I mean, they single-handedly drove down the cost of these technologies. I mean, solar PV by 85% over the last 15 years. I mean, that's really due to China's efforts. And so for the United States to try to jump into the game this late, it's certainly going to be a lot slower. And we look at the numbers and the models and the scenarios, and time is running out. We've already exceeded this Paris Agreement goal of containing global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. So we're running out of time, while the United States is thinking about protectionist policies to try to grow their own green technology industry. So I think it's unfortunate, but I think it's the reality that we have to confront. And even here in Southeast Asia, I mean, this is a region where they're trying to figure out how to align amidst this great power rivalry between the US and China, and realizing that they might have to also kind of go it alone as well. But I'll come back to that in some of the third set of questions.
Great. So let's sort of pass the baton on to Mark. And Mark, I want to get your sense of the trade relationship generally, but it may also be that you could play off of some of what Angel was just saying about clean energy competition. I just want to acknowledge to the audience that you are speaking here in your personal capacity. Like others on the chat, you've had a governmental role, but this is in your personal capacity. So to the extent that you're comfortable speaking in that way, what's your overall assessment of where the trade relationship is now after 4 years of the Biden administration, including on some of the issues that Angel was just discussing?
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Neysun. I think the trade relationship is essentially where we would have expected it to be when we think back to where we were when we were writing these papers 4 years ago. At the time, there was a robust debate within the United States about whether or not the Biden administration should seek to try to find some form of a WTO type of solution towards some of the China trade issues, whether to pull back from some of the trade tariffs policies that the Trump administration put in. And you'll recall from the paper that I put forward, I was skeptical about the WTO being an effective fora, and instead emphasize that there should be much more of an alliance-based strategy that Dave has already alluded to, but specifically on the trade and economic front. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 4 years. We've seen that the United States can put in place those types of strategies. As Dave has alluded to, it has left the United States in a better position than it was 4 years ago in terms of its own industrial base. That's not to say that there's still not a lot of work to be done there. These processes are very slow, and there remains a significant risk on both sides in terms of their exposures to one another. But I think what we have seen is the ability to put in that type of strategy to adjust tariffs as necessary without having the overall trade relationship collapse. And so the US and China still remain significant trading partners with one another. China is now the third largest trading partner of the United States. It has moved back 2 steps. The North America trade is more important than ever, but the United States still remains China's largest export market. So we have seen, right, that the US can put in place these types of trade policies to safeguard against its own interests without trade collapsing. A couple of other points I'll just point out, right? The deficit, to the extent, and the incoming team will certainly pay attention to that, right? The deficit numbers, after having gone up some, are now back down, and they are lower than they were in the 2010s. Many predicted that as the U.S. put in place these policies, including keeping tariffs or even raising new tariffs and so forth, U.S. trade to China was going to collapse. We've seen actually the contrary. The last 3 years, U.S. exports to China are higher than they've ever been. They are 30% higher than they were at the end of the Obama administration. So again, these are economies that are very much interlinked with one another. There's a trade relationship that happens, but I think each side has acted in its own strategic interest. That's the good news, right? As far as U.S. evaluation of its own policies is concerned, there still remains many bits of concern on the trade front, and some of these are new and some of these are longstanding ones. One of those I'll point out is, of course, the continued use of subsidies, and now the large production combined with the slowing Chinese economy has led to a flood of Chinese goods, particularly in a variety of different domains, but particularly tied to the green industrial policies that Angel alluded to. So we've seen a flood of Chinese EVs, Chinese solar panels, and so forth, and that has jeopardized the green transition in many of China's trading partners. We've seen China's trade with Russia increase significantly to the point where China is the key player there, fueling Russia's industrial complex. And then we've seen the trade agreement that was negotiated in the Trump administration, the Phase 1 agreement. Essentially, the targets inside those agreements have not been adhered to. So I think there are significant challenges. I don't want to say, you know, all's hunky-dory, but what I do want to say is I think the United States has shown that it can pull off an alliance-based strategy without necessarily harming its own economic interests, even with regards to its exports to China.
Great, Mark. I want to ask you a very particular follow-up, which I think many people will be interested in general, but I think is a matter of a lot of confusion, and that is specific to do with tariffs. In another round of questions, we're going to be talking of going forward, and I think we can anticipate that, based on everything we know, that the incoming Trump administration is going to put new tariffs on trade with China. But let's put that aside for the moment and just talk about the fact that the Biden administration never took down any of the tariffs that the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, had imposed on trade with China. And it sounds like, and this is, I'm just going to say this to be provocative. I'm not enough of an expert to know if this is true, but it sounds like it doesn't matter that the tariffs didn't come down, that it didn't end up being a major sticking point in the trade relationship over the last 4 years, or at least the cost wasn't felt. And I know people may disagree with that, so I guess I want to see what you would say about that. How should we think about, as we're on the precipice of a new round of tariffs, how should we think about the legacy of these tariffs that have been in place since, you know, the trade war that was launched by the Trump administration back in their first term?
Thanks, Neysun, for your question. So let me take this question in 2 different parts. One is to touch on the first part of your question as to why these tariffs continue to be in place. And then the second part on the economic impact of it. So the tariffs were put in place not arbitrarily by the Trump administration, but according to Section 301 investigation. So by statute, right, there is an authority that's been delegated by Congress that gives the White House or the executive branch power to take actions in order to resolve a problem, a trade problem, pursuant to a Section 301 investigation. So those remain in place because the problems identified in that Section 301 investigation have not been resolved. The Phase 1 agreement was an attempt to try to take the first phase in trying to get to a solution to those problems. But as I mentioned, they were not successful in terms of the problem. So if you go back to that report that came out under the Trump administration, The authority to take down those tariffs will only be if you can then point to those problems, say those problems have now been resolved. So they continue to be in place, and I expect they will continue to be in place until China takes steps to resolve those tariffs and those issues. They're only imposed on a set of goods. They're not imposed on a whole range of Chinese imports. So let me actually then address the second part of your question, right? For those goods where those tariffs were imposed, depending on how much they were increased and depending on the consumer externality and how sensitive they are to price increases and who bore there may or may not be an impact. But I would say, right, for those that weren't impacted by the new tariffs, right, certainly your premise is correct. But there were certain sectors where they were certainly very much impacted, and particularly ones where the tariff increase was larger than 10%. And overall, we can see that in the numbers. We can see that, Chinese imports as a percentage of total U.S. imports has fallen over the last couple of years. So certainly you're capturing there, and you're also seeing it in the fact that overall trade deficit between the two countries, while still very much tilted in China's favor, is lower than it was several years ago.
And just one small follow-up on the maybe the more limited impact of the tariffs. Is part of that because of the exemptions process? Is that part of that story that helps to explain why maybe the impact is not as dramatic as some people argue?
There is the exemptions process, but I think the bigger one to pay attention to is Chinese exporters developed workarounds. And so Chinese exporters have made major investments, but have also used third countries. So certainly you can look at, let's just go back to Angel's point on EVs or the parts that go into EVs. There's a number of those that have been exported to Vietnam and using Vietnam then as the base, particularly given that Vietnam is a member of the CPTPP, right, to then push outwards elsewhere. That's not because Vietnamese out there are all of a sudden going out and going crazy to buy Chinese EVs, right? It's because that's being used as a third country. And so that's part of the challenges that folks are worried about, folks are facing. So I think that's also part of the story here as well.
Super helpful. And, as we're doing this like round robin whirlwind tour through these issues, I just want to remind the audience that we will be doing deep dives on each of these sets of issues with our second cohort of fellows in the webinars we'll be doing in January and February. So this is a lot of information, and hopefully is whetting your appetite for more granular discussion on each of these sets of issues. Let's continue to another set. I want to bring in Dean Gallagher into the conversation. So if you'll permit me, I'll say Mary. Mary, you wrote in the first group of fellows on research and education issues. You wrote about Confucius Institutes, which was particular, and also Chinese Students and Scholars Associations on campuses. And you may want to update on those themes, but in general, this landscape of research and education, especially exchange, has been so much impacted by the pandemic. And we all know the numbers of the low number of students from the US who are going to China and restrictions on Chinese students coming here. What's your general sense? And we're having this conversation, just a few days after the Biden administration brought the travel warning down from level 3 to level 2, which may have an impact on some of these. Right. What's your sense of the current state of affairs on research and education exchange issues generally?
Thanks, Neysun. I guess I would categorize it as under the Biden administration, stabilized at a sort of low level, and separating it into sort of, educational exchange, students going to China and Chinese students coming to the United States, as well as, and then the other side of research and education, which is scientific collaboration between US and Chinese academics and scientists. So in terms of educational exchange, what we've seen, like you said, is, still, what I would say is, stabilized at a low level, meaning low numbers of students, particularly on the American side. Currently in China, there are about 800 American students. That's the last IIE report. That's up from 200 the year before, but down from the 12,000 prior to the pandemic. Chinese students they continue to come to the United States in large numbers. They still make up, I think about 25% of all international students. There's over 1 million now, so it's about 250,000 Chinese students, a little bit less now, I think. But that's down from almost 400,000 prior to the pandemic. The other thing I would say in terms of educational exchange is that a lot of what we see, particularly on the American side going to China, is much more sort of superficial exchange. One might call it even performative, particularly to reach the 5,000 students that Xi Jinping has announced as the goal for China. So reports of students going on, very short trips that are more like tourist excursions as opposed to doing any kind of serious study abroad or language training. On the research side, I think it's different, it's more severe, and it's, I think, much longer term. And we can talk later about the impact of the next administration. People that I know who work in STEM, who do research or had previously done research with Chinese scientists, are extremely wary of getting back into research with Chinese scientists. It depends on the field, and like Angel said, there might be some areas like in climate where there might be possibilities, but I think it's been quite difficult. A huge chilling effect of the China initiative. And I guess the way I see it, the chilling effect of the China initiative, which of course was eventually canceled under the Biden administration, but it's still, there's kind of a knockdown effect of what the US government is continuing to do on research security, what the Chinese government is doing on research security, what American universities are doing on research security, what Chinese universities are doing, not so much on research security, but particularly on exchange with American scientists. And then what individual researchers are doing to just control the risk, the sense of risk. And so it's a similar thing with censorship, where people sort of overcorrect, right? So American universities are overcorrecting in terms of trying to comply and manage this issue on their own, as opposed to having the federal government take a stronger role. And then individual scientists and researchers are also overcorrecting by being super careful and trying not to step over a line that they see as kind of blurry and might be moving, and certainly under the next administration is likely to get even worse.
I probably should have double checked this right beforehand, but as far as I know, and if anyone on the Zoom knows that I'm wrong about this, please just speak up. I don't think they have renewed the science and technology agreement. I think it's still expired. There's no they were doing these 6-month extensions. Especially, at a university as in a leadership role, how much do you think that impacts all the caution that you were just speaking to, Mary, that agreement the framework agreement is not currently operative?
I'm not sure how much the agreement affects individuals, but it's certainly it's a sign that all of these layers, all the way from the governments to the universities to the individual, there's just no appetite for risk, right? And so the agreement wasn't extended by the government. That sends a signals to the university, which sends a signal to researchers. On the State Department travel designation being relaxed, I think that perhaps is going to be good. Better, obviously better for American students going to China. It's very, very difficult for universities to run undergraduate programs when it's a level 3 warning. So I think we'll see the numbers go up from 800. But I was looking at the most recent IIE report this today and last week. There's been some articles about it. India has now surpassed China as the largest, as the country sending the most students to the United States. Huge increases from African countries like Ghana, South Asia, also like Bangladesh, and a bigger decrease in Chinese undergraduates coming to the United States. And I think that also that's Chinese undergraduates and their parents are making long-term decisions about where their kids are going to study, if they're going to study abroad. And I think we'll continue to see a decrease in the number of Chinese students getting undergraduate degrees in the United States.
I'm curious, I can bring Mark into this part of the conversation as well, because, as the director of the Fairbanks Center, you're in proximity to these exact issues very much so as well. have the same picture at Harvard that that Mary's describing at Notre Dame?
So I think one of the things you see here at Harvard is Harvard students very much realize for many different fields the importance that China is going to play. So even though China is a strategic competitor, China is going to be an important player in many of the domains, whether you're talking about finance, green technologies, biotech, and so on and so forth. So I think we see continued interest on the part of our students to make sure that they understand what's happening in China, and there's a willingness then to go to China in order to actually understand what's happening that I think many people think of as critical. There is a much larger concerns over safety and caution and even electronics policies and so forth. So we just had a discussion today at lunch on all this, and those were many of the first questions that came up with regards to the personal information data laws, the national security law, the anti-espionage law, and so forth. So it's certainly a different set of questions, but I think people realize China's not going away. China's going to continue to be a major player no matter what field they're in. And so therefore it behooves them to understand what's happening in China.
Maggie, I'm going to ask you some questions about human rights in a moment, but in the first group of fellows, you were also writing about research and education issues, and in particular about the China initiative, which Mary alluded to earlier. So I want to kind of get you in on that before we turn to human rights. Forgetting for the moment what might happen next, what's your take on what happened to what is called the China initiative in the last 4 years of the Biden administration?
Yeah, and the China initiative did formally end, and I will give credit to the Biden administration for recognizing they didn't recognize really that they didn't recognize that it had bias. They recognized the perception of bias, and so but I get why they were limited in some ways what they could say. However, they then put in place a strategy for countering nation state threats, much better that it was not just about China, but also Russia, Belarus, North Korea, not many people coming from there. But you did still see this undercurrent, of course, of concern about not just research security, but more generally about intellectual property theft. And there is a there there. I want to be clear that we shouldn't just say, no holds barred. But there is a sense too that a lot of these undercurrents have continued, and the groups that have been working on this, everything from Asian American Scholars Forum to Brennan Center to ACLU, we've been in touch this whole time. And I was at NAPABA, the National Pacific American Bar Association meeting in Seattle right after the election, and I'll say that everyone is ready to go for whatever comes down the pike, because we know that it's been rough even during the Biden administration, and it's going to get worse.
We will come back to that, but let's make sure we don't shortchange human rights issues. The Biden administration came in very much communicating that human rights was sort of central to their approach to foreign policy. Democratization was central. They had the Summit of Democracies at the beginning of the Biden administration. What's your sense of how, U.S. policy on human rights within China, human rights of Tibetans and Uyghurs, people in Hong Kong, not just how have those developed over the last 4 years, but how has the Biden administration's policy on those issues sort of evolved over time, and what's the current state on all of those types of things?
Yeah, so just, I guess the short answer is that the Biden administration has been very clear on their concern for the severely repressive atmosphere in China. And they highlight examples in the annual country report, for example, about arbitrary disappearances, torture by the government, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you can best characterize the Biden stance as a clear, consistent articulation of the multiple ways that human rights are violated in China. But, and I say this with empathy for the people formulating policy in DC, I mean, there's little evidence that that's actually moving the needle with respect to how the Xi Jinping government treats people within China. Ambassador Burns and others have said repeatedly that the administration and does not shy away from addressing issues involving human rights. And but I do think the focus has been more closed door discussions. That said, if you're trying to stabilize a complicated relationship, usually emphasizing human rights with a megaphone is not the way to do it. So I understand that in some ways. I'll say there is some really good news that just happened the last week or so, right? As part of this pre-Thanksgiving prisoner swap, where we had 3 US citizens who had been arbitrarily detained in China finally returned, we also learned that there also included the ability for 3 Uyghurs to leave China and come to the US, including Nuri Turkel's mother. And so if there's a New York Times article with some really touching photos. So those are the times that the closed door diplomacy has made, a real concrete, gain, albeit limited in numbers, but hugely, life-changing for the people involved and their family members. So as far as Xinjiang more generally though goes, I mean, the news is not good. And again, I think though what the US can do is pretty limited. Just thinking of Hong Kong, a couple of weeks ago, the State Department issued a strong statement condemning the sentencing of 45 people there for violating the national security law with what should be considered under international human rights, just peaceful expression of their political views. And the Biden administration had issued similar statements in the past when there were other sentencings or arrests. And unfortunately, there's no shortage of opportunities to issue those kind of statements because it keeps happening. Also say that the Biden administration did revisit and actually underscore business risks in Hong Kong. They have a business advisory, and this was particularly when not only do we have the national security law, but then also Hong Kong put in place additional ordinance under Article 23 of the Basic Law that further fortifies these national security concerns. And there's getting these consistent warnings about, if you are going to go to Hong Kong or to China, even though we're down to the level 2, that there does need to be sort of a personalized risk assessment about the pros and cons of doing that. So we have concerns both about people within China currently, and then also for those people who do have the choice of going in and out of China, which is a lot of people can't. What are the things that they should be considering? So I'll leave it at that for now, and we can then start to speculate for the future.
Yeah, we'll move to that in just a moment, but I think because you sort of emphasize this theme of what can the government do, what the U.S. government can do, and how to think about the prisoner releases, and the very heartwarming release of some of the Uyghur prisoners, including Notre Turkel's mother. I wonder if I can put Dave on the spot. I should mention, by the way, I should have given you all much more of your flowers in terms of your biographies. In the interest of time, I didn't. I hope people will go and read your full biographies on our project website, among other places. But Dave, of course, spent many decades in the State Department and is no stranger to these kinds of discussions and dynamics. And so I wonder if you want to say a word about that, about what are we able to do on issues that we care about because they're part of our basic value system?
Not a lot. Yeah. Maggie, I feel like we're back in the days of nameless diplomacy on human rights, where, back in the early 1990s, when I started my career with the State Department, before a president visited China, we would have a list of dissidents and say, to make the atmosphere right for the president's visit, we need to see progress on these cases. And the Chinese would, accuse us of violating their sovereignty and interfering in their internal affairs. But eventually, because they wanted to have the president come out, there would be a trickle of people coming to the United States. But I mean, the problems in China are not subject to artisanal fixes. That, small tweaks and individual releases are transformative for the individuals, but don't get to the underlying issues. So there are lifetimes worth of lists to be worked through. And I think the Biden administration's fundamental assessment is, we've got to be forthright about how we see things and forthright about how much leverage we have. And we have much less leverage than we had back 20, 30 years ago. The many, many, many decades ago when I started working. Thank you. Yeah.
So let's start to think about what happens next. And as I pivot to that, I do want to mention to those in the Zoom audience that if you would like to put questions in the Q&A, I will work those into the remaining time that we have. But let's make that pivot now. And maybe we can sort of follow the same broad order that we did in the first segment of the conversation. So I'll come back to you, Dave, and we talked at the beginning of this chat about South China Sea, Taiwan, the war in Ukraine, all the things that are bringing our security considerations into maximum focus here in the U.S. What do you think happens next as we anticipate this change of administration next month?
Right. I'm the wrong guy to ask how I think the Trump administration will behave once it's back into power. If you look at my background, you will probably conclude that I am not one of their closest advisors now that I've left government. But I think I will, and I know we've got limited time. I would just say, Neysun, I think the standard deviation of the possible is a lot bigger with the Trump administration. That the Chinese are signaling quietly, but at very high levels, that they're interested in a deal. And Mark, I know you can talk about trade, but beyond trade, on things like that would help stabilize the South China Sea, maybe the Taiwan Strait, maybe Ukraine, that they like in their. Just like Americans, I think the Chinese forget just how chaotic the first Trump administration was. But they like to think that Trump is a deal maker. He wants to make a deal, and they're willing, and they think they will emerge just as I think they feel they emerged in pretty good shape from the phase one trade deal. Mark, I'll be curious to hear what your thoughts on that. They think they would, if they can reach a deal with Trump, that they will do pretty well by it. So, that's one possibility. The other possibilities, you have the Rubio, Waltz, and China Committee Republicans wing of the Republican Party who just who see the Chinese Communist Party as a fundamental threat, and any dealing with them, let alone deals with them, is anathema to U.S. interests. So just where Biden, you kind of knew where we'd end up. I think Trump, there's just a far greater range of possibilities out there, from relatively positive to extremely negative.
Well, taking into account that you may want to be somewhat circumspect on these issues, I am going to kind of poke a little bit more on this. One of the big themes of the Biden administration approach to some of these security issues was the idea of establishing guardrails, that we knew there was going to be, very competitive dynamics, but there was a interest in having some guardrails so that things didn't spill over into outright conflict. Is your sense that that thinking will continue to be operative in the coming year or two?
I'm trying to remember the Trump administration's general view towards guardrails and institutions the last time. Now, Trump's idea of guardrails is Xi Jinping should call me, right? And that's kind of been the Biden administration, that a lot of the stability in the relationship has been because you've had the presidents meet, and then at lower levels, they've sort of used that as a cudgel to move their systems, the U.S. system and the Chinese system, in ways that they were, because of the fundamentally strained nature of the relationship, that they were naturally pulling apart, that trying to put in those guardrails. I don't think that's how the Trump administration will work. I don't envy Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. I think that his relationship with Wang, I think, will not be fruitful, because Trump's whole thing is, you got to come to me, and that would be the guardrail, and that could work, or that could go really, really badly.
So it could still be a guardrail, it's just a slightly different articulation. Although I do think, I think embedded in what you just said was this idea that even under the Biden administration, the ultimate guardrail was at the leader-to-leader level. And if anything, that might be an even more robust dynamic in the next few years.
Yeah, the challenge being, the Chinese are not crazy about late-night phone calls that haven't been prepped by a lot of diplomacy. I don't think Don is going to pick up the phone and call Jinping and say, hey, how you doing? Let's work this thing out. And without the sort of diplomacy behind that, without the National Security Advisor talking to the head of the Foreign Affairs Commission, and layers below that, the Chinese just are not comfortable with that kind of thing.
Well, we will see. Climate, Angel, what happens?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think on two levels there are some concerns. One is we're in a critical period with respect to the Paris Agreement. Countries are supposed to submit their next round of Paris pledges or their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs 3.0, by February 2025. And at the latest climate conference, which just wrapped up a week ago, only three countries had done that. So that would be the UAE, UK, and Brazil. And so United States still has time in these next few months to try to put that forth. And I think that would be really tremendous. So there's been analysis that shows that US can certainly commit to a 65% reduction in emissions from 2005 levels. And that would really put the US back on track to contributing their fair share to achieving the global climate goals. So I think that would be a really solid next move for the United States. But then I think the question then is, does then the Trump administration come back and then reverse that? And certainly there has been talk about Trump also withdrawing the United States again from the Paris Accord. And so there, I think there's definitely a real risk of backsliding there. So I think that's potentially a risk. And then I think what happens to the IRA is also another major question, but hopefully because of the way it was designed in terms of these tax incentives and these fiscal measures, that states will be less reluctant, or I guess more reluctant, to have a reversal in removing essentially money out of their pockets. And so I think hopefully we won't see too much of an impact on the IRA, but during the first Trump administration, we saw a rolling back of more than 100 environmental regulations. So I think that's certainly to be somewhat anticipated. And as Dave said, it's a little bit unpredictable. But as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I think that the good news is that there is enough of the subnational infrastructure in place to weather some of these larger uncertainties at the national level. And so I think one of the positive signs of continued progress or future continued progress is the fact that half of the US states now have their own net zero goals in place. And so that's amounting to something around 70% of US emissions. So it includes big states like California and New York and Pennsylvania have all made pledges to decarbonize their economy. So I think that will be encouraging. And that's what gives me hope that perhaps the IRA won't be completely lost, because the states still need a lot of that support from the federal government in order to implement those plans. And certainly that's one of the pieces and the bottlenecks that states and local governments have cited again and again, standing in their way of actually implementing their climate targets, is getting the financing necessary. And that really, I think the IRA really helped to open up the doors on those lines. So I think that that's something to be expected. But as I mentioned, one really bright spots during the last climate negotiations in Baku were the fact that there were a lot of these subnational exchanges still happening. There was a lot of excitement. You had Washington Governor Jay Inslee in conversation with Liu Jinming, who is now the new replacer or successor of Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese delegation. So I think that was really positive. And there was an announcement and talk of a new framework that explicitly relies on subnational cooperation between the US and China. So the fact that the Chinese gave it a name, so they're calling it this 1+6+N framework. So identifying, the 1 being the national level, the 6 being 6 areas of subnational cooperation, and then N being like other sectoral level initiatives. I think that was really positive because, of course, when the Chinese give something a name, it means that they're sticking to it. So I think that was one area where I feel enough confidence that despite a new Trump administration, there still will be enough of those backbone and framework in place at the subnational scale where we can expect to have continued cooperation going forward on that level, despite what happens at the national level. And I think we learned a lot from the first Trump administration of how to continue to work with the Chinese at the subnational level on climate change. So I think because of that experience, we'll be able to continue moving those building blocks forward.
Very, very interesting. We're starting to get close to time, so we're gonna have to get these next 3 sets of issues in a very efficient way. So let's go to trade. And Mark, we talked earlier about tariffs. We're going to get another round. We pretty much know that, right? So how rocky is this trade relationship going to get in the coming year? And, maybe I'll just add there is a sense that I think there may be a deal out there on some of these trade issues, that was something that President Trump was chasing in his first term, and the Chinese think might be out there in this second term. What do you think of that? Is there, even setting aside that I just said we're going to have all these tariffs and there's going to be a rocky, is there a deal out there that is plausible in the next year or two?
I don't see the Chinese being willing to put enough on the table for there to be a real deal that could pass political muster in the US. And let me explain what I mean by that. President Trump did a phase one agreement that he noted was going to correct for a whole set of economic injustices of the past. Those terms were not adhered to, particularly with regards to the purchase agreements, but also with regard to some of the other remaining trade factors. I don't see how he could claim that those economic injustices were addressed by his last trade agreement. So the basic political constraints that the president-elect finds himself under is there's a whole opposition that's going to be there to say he was duped or he was had. The Chinese got you to hold back on ratcheting up tariffs further. You didn't do anything, and then they didn't bother to do anything for you. So at the very least, China's going to have to fulfill the terms of the first agreement and then put a lot more on the table for them to then get a second deal out of that. And given the economic headwinds in China and what that would entail, I just don't see enough being put on the table for that. I'm happy to be surprised. Maybe there are more reformers and people willing to give more concessions in the Chinese economy and take some short-term pain for maintaining a stable trade relationship with the United States. But it seems more like, to me, China's had several years to prepare for this, and China's willing to sort of cool for the next couple of years, and it will help accelerate their own goals to de-risk from American supply chains.
And related to that, what is your sense of this point that is increasingly discussed, that the Chinese have a more kind of tailored response now, that they are not afraid to, I mean, even though their economy is having some trouble and maybe they have to weigh a bunch of different factors, that, you know, they might be more aggressive in their response to tariffs than they were in the first round?
So China's had several years now to prepare for this, including stockpiling, including de-risking some of their own supply chains. So they certainly are much more nimble. There's also legal frameworks that have been put in place over the last couple of years that we spoke about earlier. I think the tricky thing for China to thread here is, how do you take action to punish the Americans without freaking out the other foreign investors? And that's those from, because as Australians well know, what happens to me today could happen to you tomorrow, right? So they'll have to be a little bit guarded about that. Otherwise, they're going to scare away all the foreign investment. And despite China having moved up the industrial supply chain on many different fronts and being the frontier leader now in some, China is still dependent on this engagement with the rest of the world.
Great. Let's move to human rights. Let's go to Maggie. So we know that in the first Trump administration, there was a lot of discussion of sanctioning, Chinese actors who were responsible for the crackdown in Hong Kong, who were responsible for the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So even though the Biden administration did come in saying that human rights was important to them, arguably in the Trump administration, there was more aggressive action on those things. Can we anticipate a return to some of those dynamics in the coming years?
Well, my first question is, which human rights? Yes, there was an emphasis on human rights in Trump 1, but the emphasis was very much on religious freedom, as well as concerns about coerced abortions, sterilizations. I didn't hear a lot about concerns about the rights of defendants and their ability to get a fair trial. So one question will be, what human rights get foregrounded. And then who will be the voices for human rights? Certainly Rubio has a long record of criticizing the PRC government. He was the co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. He's spoken out for years on restrictions on freedom of expression. I mean, in 2015, he was one of the senators who signed the letter to then Ambassador Cui Tiankai calling for the release of the Feminist Five, the five activists who were detained when they were just making efforts to bring attention to sexual harassment. We've also got Mike Waltz, he as a member of Congress for the last 6 years has been very vocal on these issues. He, in March, was one of the members of Congress pushing the Biden administration to continue to advocate for the release of arbitrarily detained individuals, which, as we've seen, did come to fruition to a certain extent. He's done webinars that are bipartisan with Malinowski when he was in Congress and others. But at the same time, there's voices who could be in Trump's ear who really do not want to emphasize human rights. I mean, Elon Musk is not going to be helpful, especially we just saw Volkswagen pull out of Xinjiang, and Elon has a showroom for Teslas and Urumqi, right? So I think a lot of this comes down to, who is going to have Trump's ears, and to what extent will that get heard. But I'm not particularly hopeful that human rights will make a lot of headway, in part because of, as Dave was saying, how limited we are in what we can do, but also because there could be some people within the administration who have incentives to not push that to the foreground.
So many threads that I want to pick up, and we will pick them up in each of the webinars that we're going to have in January and February. But let's go to research and education issues. Mary, we started talking a little bit about this already, but do you want to add something about what the landscape is likely to look like in the coming year or two, including, do you think the travel warning will go right back up as soon as the Trump administration takes power?
The thing I'm most worried about, I guess, for the next administration, well, there's a couple of things. One is much more about U.S. domestic politics. The interesting thing for this Trump administration in particular, maybe a little bit different than last time because of what's happened with Israel and Gaza and American campuses and the downfall of so many American university administrators, is the conflation of this targeting of U.S. higher education for domestic reasons with the association, which Christopher Wray, who head of FBI, said in the last Trump administration, that American universities are the soft underbelly, the way in which China gets into American science and technology. And I think the combination of those two things in the next Trump administration could be quite dangerous for doing anything to improve research collaboration or increasing educational exchange. And I think there are very important strategic reasons to want to stabilize both of those things, accepting, of course, that there are concerns, like Maggie was saying earlier, about research security and intellectual property. And there are concerns about educational exchange and American students in China. Rubio, of course, as Maggie was just saying. So the second thing, and I'll talk about Rubio as part of the second thing, I wrote an essay recently about this, looking at things that Rubio has said or done, things that Waltz has written, and then Alex Wong, who's going in as Deputy National Security Advisor. And things that they wrote, I actually didn't totally disagree with those things. But what I really worry about, the more ideological side of the Trump administration that's represented by these appointments, is particularly their emphasis on calling for regime change in China. And I think calling for regime change in China will likely backfire and will put people who are interested in research collaboration and educational exchange in the middle, because we're so often, the people going to China having these collaborations, and sometimes I think accidentally or mistakenly associated with the government views on this. So, for example, somebody like me who has worked on human rights related to working conditions and labor in China, that's often kind of associated with this type of American foreign policy that seeks to change China. And I think that's also going to be a big concern for research and education. lastly, I think something to watch, because it will be interesting to see if this develops and quickens under the Trump administration, are the subnational level restrictions on education and research, and just general restrictions on Chinese citizens in the United States regarding their ability to buy property, and the ability of Chinese students to be employed in some jobs on American universities. Will we see that increase and spread across other American states? You see it already in Florida, Texas, and including in Indiana, where I am now.
Well, my initial plan for today's program was to ask 3 sets of questions of all of you. One was, where are we now after 4 years of the Biden administration? The second was, what can we anticipate in the coming years of the Trump administration? And then the third was going to be, what's your best idea that is plausible in the near future? But we don't have time for the third question, and I think that's actually okay, because that's the question we're going to be posing to the new cohort of fellows who will be presenting their findings and recommendations and papers in January and February. So we will basically set this up for them to take the conversation forward on each of these themes that we've discussed today. Thank you all so much for taking the time to have this conversation. Thanks everyone who's been watching on Zoom and on YouTube now live, and hopefully later on the recording as well. Remember, we're going to have a lot more of this kind of content in the months ahead. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also keep an eye out on our mailing list, where we will announce the publication of papers of the second cohort and then discuss them in similar things as today. I want to also especially thank the sponsors of the Penn Project, and in particular, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Ford Foundation, for making it possible for us to bring groups like this together and have these kinds of conversations. And just stay tuned. We have lots more coming your way. Good night, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.